Okay, Erev Tov, everybody. Yehuda and Tamar is our topic, and it was really the first few sentences that pulled me in from this particular essay. Actually, interestingly, Rav Meidan has, I think, more essays on Vayeshev than any other Parashah and Breshit, and probably by extension, maybe not all of Shmot, but it's one of his most extensively discussed parashiot, a lot of shorter essays. And so we could do Vayeshev for many years. I'm partial to this parsha. It's my bar mitzvah parsha. And so the topic that he opens with kind of makes its way not through the entirety, but through the bulk of the essay. And there are a few different themes that are pulled together here. So I think interesting, and touches on a couple of essays, at least one of which we saw in previous years. So I'll share my screen and we'll get started. Yehuda and Tamar. Schar ba'onesh, reward and punishment. An important principle in the way of the Torah, in scriptural narratives and biblical stories, is the principle, the almost the law of gemul. Hard to translate. Recompense, maybe. The reward which is received for the performance of a mitzvah, and the punishment for transgressing an aveirah. So the Ramban explains at length that this is, in fact, the purpose of the writing of Sefer Breshit, right? The various of the medieval commentaries, amongst others, ask the question, what's the role of Sefer Breshit? The Torah is really the book of the Jewish people. Start with our nationhood in some way, and they have different arguments for the purpose of Breshit. And the Ramban, in his opening comment, talks about the idea of it sort of laying out this principle of reward and punishment for us. The story of Yehuda descending, and he'll spend a little time on that word, descending from his brothers, and that which happened to Yehuda's sons, shows us the difficulty in the practical application of this law of reward and punishment, again, in practice. In the story of Yehuda and Tamar, which takes chapter 38 in the middle of the Parashah, we read a few verses in. The firstborn of Yehuda was evil in the eyes of God, and God killed him, caused his death. Side note, of course, is one of the two answers to the Torah trivia question: what biblical characters have their names as the reverse of their descriptions? Is Ra, and Noach, we're told, Matzachein Beinei Hashem, found favor in the eyes of God. Noach Chen, and Ra. Vayera Beinei Hashem asher asa vayamet gamoto, and then a couple of psukim later we're told about Onan also acting wickedly in the eyes of God, and God also causing his death. Lichora, at face value, in front of us we have a perfect example of this Torah, this law of recompense. Er and Onan are sinners, and God punishes them. But here we also see the built-in weakness of this principle. Now, I immediately think of other weaknesses to this principle, but this is the one Rav Meidan wants to focus on. Or I should say, the other weaknesses I think about to this principle are not actually illustrated here. They're that we seem to see all around us in the world, good people who suffer and bad people who prosper. But that's why he's looking at this example and saying, in this one, the principle seems to hold perfectly. All we know about these people is basically that they were evil and that they're punished. So it seems like a very simple instance of the kind of one-to-one correlation. But here's the weakness of the principle. Shaharei anashim einam rak la'atzmam. People are not only of and for themselves. Every one of them is linked to family, friends, and the like. And punishing one person for his sin impacts also his loving surroundings and environment. We're not involved in that sin, and yet that sin, is deeply impactful to them, even though the family and the network did not sin. That's a hard sentence to translate from the Hebrew. The enlightened community, which sort of holds up human rights, never found a sufficiently satisfactory solution to this problem. In other words, reward and punishment has never been sort of validated fully in light of this problem, that the punishment of a person winds up harming those whom they love, even if they were evil, however, in the plain sense, and deserved it. But the loved ones who suffer didn't sin and didn't deserve it. And this is sort of a built-in problem with this principle. A person who is imprisoned for a long period or experiences capital punishment for their crime, and their family who did not sin suffer tremendous suffering. It seems like this weakness, thank you. It seems like this weakness of this kind of rule of recompense is what necessitates an additional world, the world to come, which is all recompense in the kind of following the rule of today you do, and tomorrow you receive the reward. So it's just like a fascinating, what's Rav Meidan getting at here, that the existence of the world to come or the invention of the world to come. I'm sure he would say, the former, but it almost feels like he's hinting at that latter, that people needed to believe that there was a world to come in order to sort of make sense of the incompleteness or flaw in this system of reward and punishment. So just like a fascinating, this little philosophical, theological, almost throwaway line.
Or Hashem had to design the world that way, since
right.
people were living in communities and societies.
Right. Beautifully said. Great. Even in our chapter, the Torah explains the sin of the sons of Yehuda and is silent about what Yehuda, the bereaved father, suffers. Right, just sort of like acknowledging, there's always more to the story, but it's not always told. But we have to recognize that it's there. The juxtaposition of portions gives us an answer, a kind of a sharp answer to this question. Yehuda loses his two sons. Again, as always, take it or leave it, but the question stands, and here's an answer. Yehuda loses his two sons as a punishment for the sale of Yosef, which was at his counsel. The following psukim, at the time of the attempt to, the attempt to bring Binyamin down to Egypt in the years of famine, will prove this. Reuven said to his father, remember he was the first one to speak up when they were trying to convince Yaakov to send Binyamin down to the viceroy of Egypt, who had Shimon imprisoned at that time. Reuven said to his father, you can kill my two sons if I don't bring him to you. Place him in my hands, and I will return him. And we hear, if I am responsible for the fact that Binyamin goes down to Egypt and doesn't return, as happened to Yosef, I will accept upon myself the punishment of Yehuda, who sold Yosef, the death of my two sons, just like his two sons died. Right. So this is, of course, Rav Meidan's interpretation, but he's sort of suggesting that's the echo behind this. Right. It's too similar to. He doesn't use this language, but the language he would usually use is we can't ignore the striking similarity between the death of Yehuda's two sons and now Reuven's sort of pledge of the life of his two sons, and therefore lurking in the background must be the understanding that Yosef, who was responsible for that Yehuda was responsible for the sale of Yosef, suffered the death of his two sons as a punishment for that. And so Reuven sort of saying, I will accept upon myself that punishment if I don't succeed in the mission of bringing Binyamin back, and if he also goes missing, gets lost, doesn't return from Mitzrayim. Is there a connection between the sin and its punishment? At least partially, it seems like yes. The Torah doesn't tell us anything about Er's sin, but the sin of Onan is expressed. That his brazen hatred for his brother, to the point at which he is willing to erase his name and not establish continuity and offspring and seed for him. Right? Remember, he had the Torah tells us there that he says to himself, if I go to his wife, to Tamar, to Er's wife, then the children that would be born would really accrue to Er's memory, and I don't want to do that. So I'm going to spill my seed on the ground, and that was evil in the eyes of God, and God killed him. So we know what Onan's sin was. It was that again, Rav Meidan formulates it as hatred. His hatred for his brother was so great that he was willing to erase his name, or unwilling to create a continuity for his name. Maybe, says Rav Meidan, Onan had someone to learn this kind of powerful brotherly hatred from, and the attempt to erase a brother's name from upon earth from. He learned it from the actions of his father, Yehuda, that he did to Yosef, his brother. So this is Rav Meidan's kind of the framework that he's setting up. Again, coming back to his ultimate question, which is, how do we understand, reward and punishment in light of the people around us? So how could it be that Yehuda would have to suffer the bereavement of two sons, which is such a great, unspeakable suffering because they endured a punishment for something they did wrong? So Rav Meidan's answer here, again, this is not necessarily a global thing, but Rav Meidan's answer here is Yehuda did something wrong, and so somehow the punishment here ultimately accrues also to him because he actually did something wrong, and a very similar type of thing wrong, such that Onan really was carrying out the kind of horrible way of articulating it, but the family legacy, or a value in the negative, which he imbibed, took in from his father. Right? This is, I think, a typical approach of trying to see punishment not as unrelated, retribution, but as sort of consequences of action, almost natural outgrowths of action. Did Yehuda learn immediately the right lesson from now this disaster which befell him? It seems like not. Meaning, now with the death of his two sons, did he suddenly get it that he needs to be a more sensitive brother, family member, etc.? It seems like not. As after the death of Onan, it says, Yehuda said to Tamar, and those who learned with Judy Klitzner at our Scholar in Residence a few weeks ago, she focused in on this failure of Yehuda as well. Yehuda said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, sit as a widow in your father's house till the third son, my son Shelah, will grow up, saying to himself, lest he die like his brothers. And what was this, lest he die like his brothers? Rashi says, Muchzeket hi sheyamutu anasheha. Right? She must have this quality that her husbands die. Right? It's her fault. It's her problem. She's to blame, and therefore I can't expose my third son to this curse or this proclivity or whatever it is. Dok, right? Notice well, it's not that Yehuda is the one who is, has this consistent pattern of his sons dying because of his sin. Rather, she's the one to whom he attributes this pattern that her husbands die. She's the one who's guilty in his eyes. This sort of, wrongful plot will cycle through multiple additional iterations until Yehuda learns that which he was supposed to learn. By the way, just a little, once in a while, I feel like there's a certain kind of, midrash to read into Rav Meidan's words. And I think it's striking that he uses here the word alilatenu, our kind of wrongful behavior. It should just be like a lyrical, the one that's in our story, the one we're talking about. But I also wonder if subtly he's also trying to sort of say this is a lesson we are all always needing to learn, and it often circles back on itself until the Jews, the people of Judah, learn that which they need to learn. It's a hard, seeing our own wrongful place in a cycle is very, very hard to see. It's easier to point a finger somewhere else, and that often builds on itself until we're able to learn what we need to learn about recognizing our own role in a negative system.
Rabbi, what's the word at the beginning of that paragraph?
Dok is like notice carefully, like from the language of a diuk, like an inference, or like midakdek, like pay close attention to this. Sometimes at the end of like a little analysis, you'll have dok, which is like dalid vav with a little, 2 lines, and then kuf, which I think is an abbreviation for like dok or dakdek vitim tzaka. Like if you take a look at this, you'll find that it makes sense, something like that. But here it's just the word. Look carefully, pay close attention. Is what it means. Okay, that's part 1. Part 2, and these are of course always connected in some way. Vayered Yehuda. Yehuda went down. It seems like the sale of Yosef, the sin of the sale of Yosef, isn't a sufficient sin to justify the terrible, disaster which befell Yehuda, the death of his 2 sons. And we have to pay attention to an additional detail. And again, sometimes like the piling on of explanations reminds us, as he says here, that none of them necessarily seem sufficient. And so one could also just end with the conclusion that it's unexplainable and it's not all, reward and punishment. But I think Rav Meidan wants to work within that framework. So he's now sort of saying, okay, we have one sort of punishment, the sin of the sale of Yosef, but it's not sufficient. Yehuda has other wrongdoings that need to be, incorporated here. So chapter 37 begins. And this is a theme we've seen in Rav Meidan before. I've seen some references to it. At that time, Yehuda went down from his brothers, and he, strayed towards or directed himself towards an Adulamite man named Chira. And Yehuda saw there the daughter of a Ish Kanani. I'm not going to translate. There's debate about whether it means Canaanite or merchant, although Rav Meidan will take his position in a moment, whose name was Shua. And he took this daughter of Shua and came to her they had their children. The word Yerida, going down, is easily explained in the plain sense of it, which is that Yehuda, who until now was dwelling with his family in the highlands of Hebron, in the mountainous region of Hebron, now goes down topographically to the lowlands, to the kind of plain or strip of land of Adulam. But together with this, scriptural language and rabbinic language preserves this word, particularly for going from Eretz HaKodesh el Eretz HaAmim, from Israel to other places. I mean, until today, we have that language. Yes, we have that language for Yerida, right? Aliyah is going to Israel. Yerida is leaving Israel, and you have it in the Gemara all the time when Chachamim were going from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael and vice versa. Going to Eretz Yisrael was Salik, Allah, and going to Bavel was Nachit, Yarad, went down. So this language is consistent. So even though we have the topographical plain sense analysis, we have to keep in mind that this would typically refer to leaving Eretz Yisrael. But this area of Adulam is found in the Holy Land. And from the perspective of the sort of special qualities of the land itself, it is no less sacred than Hebron. But it seems like we must conclude that even inside Eretz Yisrael, one can make Yerida. When a Jew leaves their holy community that they live in and immerse themselves in a place inhabited by strangers to the land. Again, of course, an ironic term in this period because Am Yisrael were strangers in the land relative to the nations who were living there then. But from a destiny perspective, not. Or maybe here we can say Nachri not as strangers to the land, but strangers to the Jewish people, other nations. We can sort of test this statement or demonstrate the truth of this statement from the Midrash in the Sifra, which says anyone who goes to Chutz La'aretz is like an idol worshiper. And in fact, about David, it says, "Cursed are they before me because they have chased me out today from having a part in the portion of God, saying, go worship other gods." Now, would it ever have risen in our minds? Would we ever have considered the possibility that David HaMelech would worship idols? No, rather, what is he saying in this line? He's expounding and saying anyone who lives in the land of Israel accepts the kingship of heaven, and anyone who goes into Chutz La'aretz is like they worship idols. These words of Chazal in degrading dwelling in the diaspora are expounded here from David's descent from the mountainside to Gat, which is identified today with Tel Tzafit near Kfar Menachem, which is near the Adulam region that we were talking about in Yehuda's time. So David remained in Eretz Yisrael at the time of this pasuk that we're darshaning here in the Midrash. But the fact of his fleeing from the kingdom of Shaul and declaring his loyalty to Achish, the king of Gat, which is what's being spoken about in that pasuk, is interpreted by Chazal as avodah zarah, right? So this is another example where we have this sort of notion of leaving the land of Israel being described by someone in a situation where they didn't really leave the land of Israel. They just left the Jewish community residence in the land of Israel. And so this idea that moving out of that is like leaving the land of Israel, has another root in this midrash. Yehuda, so that's the David story. Now coming back again, Yehuda also now in his descent to Adulam becomes a citizen of a Canaanite, dwelling area, takes himself a Canaanite wife and immerses himself in the Canaanite environment. And that's why in that footnote, he says, we mentioned in the previous essay that most of the commentaries refuse to accept the possibility that Bat Shua was really a Canaanite. When it says that he, went and came to this Adulamite man and then saw the daughter of an Ish Kanaani, there are other interpretations which are offered that the Kanaani might mean merchant, things like that. Rav Meidan says we're explaining the plain sense, and this is also an alternative explanation which is given in the Ibn Ezra, that Canaanite really means Canaanite, and what Yehuda was doing here was leaving the environment of his brothers and his family, the Jewish settlement, and going to Canaanite lands. The punishment of Yehuda here then is parallel to the punishment that Elimelech experiences in Megillat Ruth. In the years of famine, Elimelech goes with his family and actually leaves the land of Israel and sets himself in the land of Moab. Quickly, Elimelech dies and his two sons die, Machlon and Chilion, without any offspring left, as happened to Er and Onan. And there too, the story ends with a sort of strange levirate marriage type thing that happens, as happens in our Parashah also, with Yehuda winding up kind of being that lever for Tamar at her initiation, unknowingly to him. A similar instance is the story of Lot, who leaves Avraham's house. And I think this is the one, if you sort of think about setting up the parallels, the Megillat Ruth one is more obvious. The Lot one, I think, is really, really interesting and consistent with a lot of Rav Meidan's analysis in Breshit, where he's sort of looking at who are the adjacent family members and how close do they stay to the Abrahamic line, and what does that mean for their descendants. So Lot is a very good kind of marginal case. So a similar thing happens with Lot, who leaves Abraham's house, goes to the Kanaani who's dwelling in Sodom. Like Yehuda, his wife dies and his two married daughters die, so two offspring as opposed to sons. He's left without any children except for, and there's the except for, but except for his young daughters who have no one to marry them. Right. So at that moment, he's sort of his lineage and legacy is undetermined. Doesn't have continuity. And there too, the Parsha in the cave ends with a strange process, which is also similar to Yibum. And we studied that Lot and his daughter's story 1 or 2 years ago, where he made that argument about the sort of Yibum type structure. So again, this is a thought in Rav Meidan's mind that we've seen in now for the second time here. And it is described in the style of the Yibum portion from Devarim. In all three of these cases, we're talking about a kind of a severe onesh karet. We don't know what karet means, but in its plain sense, it means somehow being cut off from the community. About which, were it not for the kindness of God in establishing this sort of yibum notion, the person who was separating from the community and joining the non-Jewish community would be left without any continuity. Joining the non-Jewish community and setting up a family there would be left without any continuity. I forgot to look up what plant ar is. If anybody knows, feel free. In the wilderness, that won't see any positive future. One last note: there are, of course, family connections between all three of these cases, and this is sort of the classic point which is made here. The origin point of Ruth the Moabite, who establishes her, is the one who establishes the continuity of the family for Elimelech after its destruction, is from Lot and his daughters. And Boaz, who together with her establishes that continuity, is from the descendants of Yehuda and Tamar, right? So all these stories, merge. James's question about Lot having 4 daughters. Yes, that's not a gray sheet. Hold on. Go to that story. Yeah, in Yud Tet Yud Bet, the men say to Lot, Od milecha po chatan uvanecha uvenotecha v'chol asher lecha ba'ir. Who else do you have in here? A son-in-law, your sons or your daughters? And then it goes on and says in Yud Daled, Vayetze Lot vayedabel chatanav lokchei v'notav. He goes out and says to his sons-in-law, those who had married his daughters. And then just a couple of psukim later, it says, and they didn't want to leave with him. I think that's the story. Were you thinking they were the same 2 daughters, James?
Yes, but I guess maybe the clue is that he sent out the daughters who had not known men.
Right. All right, that story warrants a review, but yeah, okay, good. Okay, let's keep going. Let me pause for a moment. Any questions, comments, reactions? We're at about the halfway point. Just a moment summary in case it's helpful. So we have, in this framework of reward and punishment, the question is, why did Yehuda have to suffer the death of his two sons? Yes, they were evil, whatever that means. We don't know about Er's evil, but we know about Onan's. But how could this happen to Yehuda? And within that framework of reward and punishment, Rav Meidan wants to suggest that Yehuda is also bearing punishment for things he did wrong, the sale of Yosef, and now the departure from the Jewish community. Again, how do we think? It's heavy to think about that as a sin, but that's a strong biblical framework. That's again, does it warrant the death of your children? Feels hard to accept. Maybe somehow that's why Rav Meidan is trying to put it together with the other one. Again, if we don't want to take this in terms of takeaways from the essay itself, if we don't want to take the reward and punishment piece as fully, it also at least suggests to us that there's sort of textual grounds for the criticism of Yehuda's action here, because that's what I would say thus far. Go ahead, Lance.
A couple of things. Number one, the central episode, for me at least in the Talmud, is when Rabbi Elisha ben Abuya comes to the situation where one man obeys God and is killed and dies at God's hand, and the other man disobeys God and goes on and lives. And that's what I call the paradox of God. And I think that Richard Rubenstein, were he here at this moment, would suggest that after Auschwitz, the whole thing about reward and punishment is nonsense.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, I brought it in particular because a struggle is even a generous term, with the notion of reward and punishment. I always turn to the couple of biblical passages that raise those questions, the book of Job, and most of all, that passage in Pirkei Avot where the sages say, I don't have it at my fingertips in Hebrew, but we have ein biadenu, something like lo mi yisurei tzadikim v'lo mi shalvat harashaim. We have nothing literally in our hands to explain or understand the prospering of the wicked and the suffering of the righteous. So I mean, there's certainly a strong wrestling with the themes of reward and punishment that are so straightforward in sections of the Bible. So that's why, like, Rav Meidan's interacting with it, caught my eye. But you won't get disagreement from me on the sort of really, in our world today, and even in reading the biblical stories, even with the biblical framework of it, struggling with that. So great, let's read on a little more. Okay, Kaziv. And by the way, I should mention every week I basically want to bring the additional essay in this book that I showed you before, Makomba Parashah, because so many weeks Rav Meidan's zeroes in on something that has to do, especially in Breshit, with geography and places. And this book, which has on each parasha, an analysis of a particular place that's mentioned in the parasha, also has a really lovely essay on Kaziv. And maybe for one of the Chumashim one year, we'll actually study from that book, which is a lot of fun. Totally other dimension of accessing the Tanakh through the geography and history. So Kaziv, the birth of Yehuda's third son, Shelah, the Torah in the birth of, or to the birth of Yehuda's third son, Shelah, the Torah adds a little additional note which cries out, interpret me, explain me. As it says, 38:5, Vatosef od vateled ben vatikrat shemo Shelah. Yehuda's wife has a third child, and she calls his name Shelah. V'haya bichziv belidata oto, and it was, or he was, in Kaziv when she gave birth to him. By the way, I can't remember if I heard someone say this before myself, but I think it's always striking to think about his name Shelah, which literally means Shelah, hers, right? Like the whole, like it's sort of blinking in Yehuda's face the whole time. This third child this third son who he's sent Tamar away and told her she can't have until he grows up. The child's name is like, I belong to her. So I always think it's a striking kind of irony, and again highlights Yehuda's sort of difficulty in facing what he's supposed to be doing. But that's not the point of here. The point of here is that he was in Kaziv when she gave birth to him. The commentaries discuss this question. What's this second, latter phrase coming clause coming to teach us? The Ramban suggests that Shelah and Kaziv are synonyms, just like we find in the portion of Elisha and the Shunammite woman, in different parts of Malachim Bet chapter 4. She said, "No, my master, man of God, don't techazev b'shivchatecha, lie to disappoint," something like that. And then later, "Halo amarti lo tashle oti." Did I not say, don't tashle oti? Can deceive or mislead me, right? So we have Kaziv and Shelah are seemingly synonyms. So kind of still doesn't explain the whole thing, other than then sort of saying, well, I guess it does. She called him Shelah because she was in the condition of something Shelah-like, when she or Yehuda was, or it happened in a condition of something of the same, root in a sense when she gave birth to him. So whatever it means, this was the circumstance of his birth, and so she gives him a name which is synonymous with that key word. But still, it seems like the pasuk is, begging for more interpretation. In my humble opinion, says Rav Midan, we're talking here about a place, Kaziv, which was in the mountains of Hebron. And this is what the Makom Parashah book goes into length about, the meaning of the word, and the geography of the location. The first two sons, Er and Onan, Bat Shua, Yehuda's wife, gave birth to them in the lowlands amongst the Canaanites. But Shelah, she gave birth to in the mountain of Hebron, not far from Yaakov Avinu and his house, right? Even though, of course, there's a whole other question of, could it mean that Yehuda was in Kaziv and she wasn't, and they were actually not together? But Rav Meidan's reading is, V'haya, he was, the family was, they were at the time in Kaziv, meaning they had moved back closer to home. Shelah merits being counted with, going back, not far from Yaakov Avinu and his household. Er and Onan did not merit, continuity in Am Yisrael. Shelah merits to be counted with Bnei Israel who go down to Egypt, and the nation, the people which come out of Egypt with Moshe Rabbeinu, because he was born as a part of Am Yisrael, who was dwelling then in Har Hebron, and not a part of this Canaanite family that was dwelling in Adulam, in Emek Ha'ilah. Again, now it's sort of like the flip. But if that was Yehuda's choice, then why should the children, be punished or rewarded as a result? So again, coming back to this sort of broader context, reward and punishment approach, but also just interesting in light of, imagining in the story, if they actually did move back, what motivated that change in that moment. So a lot to think about in that little section. Okay, last piece. Bein Yeush Latikva. Now Rav Midan is going to try to bring some of the pieces together between despair and hope. We can, and it's a stretch, but without an attempt to kind of justify, we can words fail me at this hour. We can understand, I'll just say it that way. We can understand if we stretch, even if we can't justify, the way of Lot and Elimelech, who had gone to these strange lands or into the stranger communities at times of famine, in periods of famine. But Yehuda, the choice amongst the tribes from one perspective, what was the reason for his Yerida and kind of establishing himself in this family of Shua, the Canaanite? Why? How could the children of our forefathers, our holy forefathers, go on this path? What was the justification for this? The only acceptable answer, in my opinion, is Yeush, despair. The brothers, seeing the unbearably painful grief of their father Yaakov understood what they had done to him. But what had been done could not be undone. The guilt was sort of turned primarily towards Yehuda, the leader of his brothers, and the one who suggested the sale. And Yehuda couldn't, bear his guilt in this story, in this that he had incurred in this episode. He separates himself from the family and chooses another world, a world which is not part of the legacy of our, ancestors and their holy community, just as Yishmael and Esav did, choosing their own way. Again, really choosing as opposed to being, Yishmael and Esav, depending on the perspective of the story, did they choose or were they sort of redirected or dismissed? But again, looking at it without those sort of explicit causal factors, there were those who stayed and there were those who went, and Yishmael and Esav went, and Yehuda couldn't bear to live with himself in his community of family origin, and he had to leave. Again, it's like interesting, Rav Meidan sort of question, like what could lead to such a thing, and it's sort of this sense of, only the despair of guilt could drive someone to make such a decision like this. It was such an unbearably great sin, because the feelings of guilt and despair couldn't resolve the sin. They're only like a false substitute for repair and tshuva, right? Meaning Yehuda maybe had some other approach, but he wasn't choosing it. He was stuck in this place of despair and guilt. The punishment for the two sins, the sin of the sale of Yosef and the sin of going to the Canaanim, was quick in coming, and Yehuda loses his family without the chance to marry off Shelah, his third son, and without the chance to establish a family. And now comes the third sin, cohabiting with a harlot, out on the road. The Rambam explains this puzzling behavior of Yehuda as a permissible and legitimate action. Rambam in the laws of Ishut, of relationships, maybe, chapter 1, halacha 4 says, before Matan Torah, before the giving of the Torah, a man could encounter a woman in the marketplace, the public square, and if he and she wanted, he could pay her wages and have sex with her, right? In the, not quite the crossroads, but out wherever they were, and go on his way. And this relationship is called Kedeshah. So that's what happens with Yehuda and Tamar, and this is the Rambam saying that was a 100% acceptable format for relationships prior to Matan Torah. But the sages, rightfully so, saw in this a sin and a degradation, and therefore they explained Yehuda's behavior in a different way. Quoting from the Midrash Seichel Tov, God kind of summoned into Yehuda an angel, a messenger who was appointed over lust, and that's what drove Yehuda out onto the road to Tamar against his will, against his better judgment, something like that. This angel of lust, which suddenly appears here, seems to us to be, this is Rav Meidan doing his midrashic interpretation of the midrash, seems to us to be this truly an angel of despair. Right? The best, most powerful, potent thing a person has is their seed, their opportunity to propagate, and the ownerless casting away, careless casting away of that seed on the road is a clear statement of a person to themselves, that they no longer see any chance of enduring continuity, no longer seeing for themselves any chance of having a family, right? So this is kind of Rav Meidan's reading of what's going on with Yehuda. His incredible guilt at the sin of the sale of Yosef and seeing what it did to their father kind of drives him to despair. He can't tolerate anymore being with his family. He goes away, finds Batshua, starts a new family. But the punishment for, those two things, so this is what he was talking about, everything being mitgalgel, it all kind of folds over onto itself. The punishment for those things is the death of his sons. He doesn't see a way to have continuity through Shelah. He sees that as, the danger of Tamar. And so he's lost, and he sees no continuity for himself. He kind of gives up on himself. And so that's what would drive him to, visit a harlot on the road. But, says Rav Meidan, standing opposite every angel of despair is an equally powerful angel of hope, here in the image of Tamar. The woman who lost her two husbands, not as a result of her own guilt, and who was prohibited to marry this third son, doesn't let go of the chance to establish offspring and maintain a name for those who have died. When she, conceives through Yehuda, and her death sentence of burning is judged, together with the baby child in her womb, she stands up opposite Yehuda with his, signet and cord seal, but she doesn't reveal a thing. She gives him free choice to try to continue to protect his seeming honor, continuing on this way of destruction and despair because of those original feelings of guilt, and be left without children, or acknowledge his mistake and open up a new chapter of repair and restoration. One hand's breadth from the abyss, Yehuda stops and chooses a new way. There remain for the brothers all hard days ahead, starting from the day on which they are demanded to bring Binyamin down to Egypt. And there are yet heard in Yaakov's family voices of guilt. The brothers, now quoting from Genesis 42, the brothers said to each other, "But we are guilty for our brother, whose great pains we saw and suffering we saw when he cried out to us and we did not hear." This is them talking to themselves. They don't know that Yosef hears them down in Egypt. And that's why this great difficulty is happening to us. And Ruvain, in those moments of test, will kind of express these feelings of guilt. Ruvain says to them, or maybe try to actually, lilabot maybe means to try to deflect these feelings of guilt, right? Ruvain says to them, "Didn't I tell you, don't sin against the child? And you didn't listen. And now it's his blood which is being sought." And Ruvain will also express these kind of voices of despair. As Ruvain says to his father, right, as we quoted at the beginning, "You can kill my two sons if I don't bring him back to you," right? That's the kind of wrong route. But it's specifically Yehuda now, coming to this later iteration of the story, where again they're in trouble. Ruvain is in the kind of cycle of despair. It's specifically Yehuda who knows in these crisis moments to lift up a different voice. The feelings of guilt he trades in for a sense of responsibility, and the despair he exchanges for repair. As those famous words, Yehuda says to his father Yisrael, "Send the lad with me. I will take responsibility for him. You can claim him from my hand." And then later says to Yosef, "Place your servant in place of the child as a servant to my master, and let the boy go up with his brothers." Yehuda says this, for himself in these coming portions. He learned it from his daughter-in-law Tamar in our portion. So again, the sort of second half. The first half is laying out this Torah of reward and punishment, raising the question of its sort of incoherence or weakness in the way in which others are impacted, attempting to address that by saying in the story of Yehuda, Yehuda's suffering is actually brought about by himself in the sale of Yosef and in the choice to go down to leave the Jewish community and go to the Canaanite community, still within the land of Israel, but noticing that that's sort of tantamount to a chutz la'aretz reality, which for Rav Meidan's, Zionist thought is an interesting kind of idea, right? That, land and people are both extremely relevant. And even within the land, sort of the question of community is a very live and important question. Then sort of continuation of that piece, and he also puts this in the context of the other stories which he sees as similar. Then he sort of closes that up by noting that in some way Yehuda maybe actually went back close to home, and that's how Shelah sort of escapes the fate of his brothers. And then comes back to the question of why indeed did Yehuda leave the family, and sees that as his feelings of despair over the guilt of his role in the sale of Yosef. It doesn't let him off the hook from the punishment, in part because his response to that despair is to leave and not to sort of stay in it and try to repair. And so that leads to the second sin, the sin of going down to the Canaanite community. And then with the punishments that befall him leads to the third sin, which is the sort of expression of despair, which leads him to the Kedeshah, to the harlot of Tamar. And then thanks to her heroic kind of rescue by a different model, he in the last moments is able to right his course, and from that then to be the rise to the leader of the brothers, not just the leader of the sale of Yosef, but now the leader of the redemption of Binyamin. Thoughts or reactions? Dad, go for it.
So did Tamar have twins, or is that Ruth that I'm thinking of?
Yes. Tamar had twins, Peretz and Zerach.
So to me, that's quite remarkable. There's two sons everywhere in the story.
Yeah.
And these two sons are, I guess, replacements for Yehuda's first two.
Right.
But also I found interesting that Yehuda now has established a family. And when he is confronting Joseph, he says, put me in prison, just let Binyamin go. He's really going down. And his future would be, he's in Egypt for the rest of his life. I mean, he's willing to do that now that he knows he's established a family.
Beautiful. Yeah. The pairs of sons is very striking all the way throughout. And as Rav Meidan builds also, and daughters in the Lot story. And yeah. Great. Thank you. Both comments. David L.
Hi. Well, it even goes on with the pairs because Yosef has a pair of sons in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So I have questions. I think this is a really amazing, really, really interesting read. What happens to Peretz and Zerach and Tamar? Are they embraced and do they come into the family?
Good question. Trying to think about what we know about that. I don't know. What are you thinking about in that context?
Well, I'm thinking about the contrast to the sons of Yosef,
Mm-hmm.
where Rav Meidan is suggesting that Yehuda has been saved from this path of despair and destruction, and he's adopting a new way. And the example that, and it naturally came to you to say, and look at the way he relates to the brothers and the role he can play within the brotherhood in going into the future. What is the role he's playing within his biological family going into the future? And the contrast with Yosef, I mean, it just calls out that Yosef's two sons are fully accepted into the family to the extent that they become Shvatim, ones of the tribes.
Yeah, I'm just looking for a moment when it describes, I mean, when it describes who goes down to Mitzrayim, of course, Peretz and Zerach are listed. I don't think we know much. Trying to think if there are any other stories or references.
That maybe is a good enough proof that they are accepted into the
Right,
family, and that
right.
and that Rav Meidan could have tied that in together, and it's really very cool. I mean, the other obvious thing is that he has sons who are, or at least one son who is unwilling to allow his seed to impregnate someone, and Yehuda is not actually concerned
Right,
about
right. Although there's that interesting line, and I think and Judy Klitzner picked up on it on her Friday night lecture at the Scholar in Residence weekend, which is at the end of that story. Says says Tzadikami meni ki al kein lo natati ela she'ela b'ni v'lo yasaf od ledata. He was not intimate with her anymore, and the sort of I don't know what that means about her place in the family, but as sort of she read it as a kind of a recognition of whatever happened there was, it served a purpose, but this is not a relationship which is supposed to continue in this dynamic, and that was a kind of a growth moment for him. I'm trying to remember what she compared or contrasted it to, but I have to look back at the source sheet. Yeah, and it reminds me also even just of last week with Yaakov and Rav Meidan's thesis that Yaakov stopped cohabiting with any of his wives after that moment with Reuben and Bilhah. So, yeah. Rav Scott?
I was just going to say what Sally wrote in the chat.
Oh, hold on. Megillah Root 418. That's the end of the Megillah.
The Peretz is in the line to two.
Yeah. So it's certainly established as a part of the ongoing legacy, but we not an important enough character, it seems like, in his own right in the moment to know any more about family dynamics at that time, but certainly going forward is totally accepted and built in there. Yeah. All right, awesome. Thanks everybody. Wonderful rest of the week, and hope to learn again next week. Love to mom and dad, to all. Laila Tov.